welcome to our next film looking at aspects of negotiation, and this time we're looking at barriers to communication. And just to remind ourselves that, as Roger Fisher and others said, unfortunately when it comes to communication, the realist has to think that whatever you say, you should expect that the other side will almost always hear something different. We're going to explore some of the things that can get in the way of effective communication in a negotiation context over the next few slides. Some of the types of barriers that have been categorised are on the screen now, as you can see. We're just going to take some of these in turn and think about some examples of them. And then in other parts of our study, we're going to think about how the effective negotiator can work to overcome these barriers. First of all, technological and physical barriers. Well, this can be anything from the physical environment in which the negotiation is supposed to take place. This can be about background noise. This can be about accessibility. What are the particular needs of the people negotiating, for example, and is the physical environment actually set up in a way that facilitates this? But this can also mean things such as technological interference, and we live in a globalised and not so much wired up as wireless world now, which is fantastic and allows us to communicate across vast distances, time zones, etc. But that also means that we are much more dependent on the technology working for the vital communication to actually take place. So an effective negotiator has to think about these and how these physical and other environmental impediments might get in the way of the dialogue that we're trying to establish or to continue. Cultural barriers. Now, this is a very massive and complex area that bridges across from negotiation theory, communication theory, sociology, psychology, and so on and so forth. And the starting point is really to understand that all of us are products of the culture in which we ourselves grew up, in which we were formed. And this has been likened to the idea of a goldfish in a goldfish bowl who are not aware of the existence of water. It's taken for granted, but it is immersive and all around them. But for those from other cultures, we look upon them as being different, and as a result, we cannot necessarily think about what we look like to others, but we can understand that they seem different to us. Some of the things that might separate us from others when it comes to thinking about cultural barriers to communication. It's about the nature of the society we grew up in. So, was it an individualistic society, perhaps a capitalistic society, or was it a collective society? Think of the Far East Asian societies, for example. And with that will come the notion of whether the communication culture was of what we call low context or high context. Do I see myself simply as a transacting individual, or do I see myself as a small part of a much larger social unit with stronger family and community bonds, and where there is a much greater idea of serving a greater whole than merely myself and my immediate family within that context, within that community, society or culture? Is the society authoritarian or democratic? What do we think about notions of human rights, for example, freedom of expression, how we express ourselves? You could add to that whether the society is hierarchical or is a much more level playing field for people, and that could be taken across genders, races, ethnicities, and so on. And just another couple of examples there. Is the society a secular one, or is there an established religion which may have a profound effect on how people live their lives, the values they hold, the norms that they live according to or are meant to live according to, and how they express themselves and relate to others as well? And that can either be secular against religious, or indeed it could be one religion against another religion, and how they interpret the world according to whatever particular scripture and set of values that they attach to that dictates to them. All of these things will have a massive influence on how we perceive the actions of others, and also on how we express ourselves. Mayer has put it in an article which is on your list. In an international negotiation, you may not have the contextual understanding to interpret your counterpart's communication, especially the unspoken signals. We looked before about how communication isn't just about what we say, it's about how we say it, it's about how we look and appear in our physical embodiment when we actually express ourselves as well. And all of these things are up for massive interpretation and massive misinterpretation when we are communicating across cultures. Mayer goes on to say, when managers from different parts of the world negotiate, they frequently misread such signals, reach erroneous conclusions and act in ways that thwart their ultimate goals. The potential for misinterpretation, again, is enormous. And we will think on another occasion about how we might then guard against these potential misinterpretations and prepare effectively for cross-cultural negotiation. One aspect of cultural expression, of course, is through language. And linguistic barriers can also mean that we are misunderstood, not just in the sense of that we do not speak one another's language, but that we do not understand the fully nuanced and contextual meaning of a language that is not native to our own. Let me give you a very light-hearted example. In the 1960s, the then American President John F. Kennedy visited the then divided city of Berlin, divided between communist East and capitalist West. And he made a speech in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, and he declared to the crowd of German people, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Now, what he meant was, I am in solidarity with the people of Berlin. What he did not know was that in the local idiom, a Berliner was actually a very well-liked pastry. And so when he made this ringing declaration in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, many of the Germans in the crowd were a little perplexed to hear the president say that actually, in fact, he was declaring himself a donut. How we overcome these linguistic barriers, perhaps through the intermediary of an interpreter, again, is an area that is potentially fraught with difficulty because of the need for that translation to take place. Mayer has created a matrix of people's communication style, which these styles are in themselves, of course, expressions of and symptoms of the culture in which they have arisen. So if you look, the poles of the matrix go from the emotionally expressive to the emotionally unexpressive and reserved below the line. And from left to right, the more confrontational and direct linguistic and communication styles, as against on the right-hand side, the more face-saving, confrontationally, conflict-avoidant communication styles. And you might want to take a moment just to see where your own nationality is on the matrix and see whether you would agree with that. Obviously, there's a huge degree of generalisation here, but Mayer, I think, is making a reasonable point that our culture influences both the language we speak and how we then express ourselves in the full richness of that language, and that then can create an impression that we may not intend in the person to whom we are communicating, with whom we are communicating. Emotional and psychological barriers can also get in the way of us when we are attempting to communicate, and I just want briefly here to hark back to earlier study to say that, remember, when we are negotiating, almost by definition, it's because there is at least a perception of difference, if not actual dispute or conflict. And in these contexts, we are not, though we might want to, we are not dancing. It's much more likely that we are in a situation of difference or conflict. And human beings in that situation of difference or conflict are not at their best. They are prone, therefore, to all the cognitive biases that we have looked at earlier, to attribution error, to misattribution of motives, to reactive devaluation, to perceiving everything that our antagonist says or does to us in the most negative way possible, and at the same time forgiving ourselves and expecting the most positive light to be placed on whatever we say or do towards them. And all of that means, as we've looked at earlier, that we are so much more prone to misinterpreting the signals that are coming from our other party in the negotiation. So that's just a very, very quick walk through some of the barriers. We will pick up, as I say elsewhere, how we might think about overcoming some of these barriers. And just for the importance of doing so, just let's leave ourselves with a quote from William Ury from his most recent book. He said if he had to pick a single most important skill for a negotiator, it would be the ability to put oneself in the other person's shoes. And this again harks back not only to the need for effective communication, but for the desire to explore the underlying interests and really to see what the situation looks like from the perspective of the other.